Hey, grade 7s, welcome to lesson 2.6 Economy and Government in New France. Today we're going to learn how the King of France and the Catholic Church influenced the development of New France. So stick around and let's learn something. Lesson 2.6 How did the King of France and the Catholic Church influence the development of New France? This is the last lesson of the French in North America, chapter 2. So, this lesson is all about the economy and the government of New France. And the last time we left off, the last lesson, we saw that the population of New France, was needing a big boost. So if they want to be successful, they are going to need more people coming to the colony. We also learned that land ownership caused some major issues with the First Nation. So how are we going to come and increase this population? So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to see how the Catholic Church does their thing to help in the development of New France. So we're going to start with the royal takeover. And we know that the colony is dependent on New France, okay? So New France is sending over colonists, supplies, it's supplying the military as well for any situations or issues that might arise. We will have New France being supported by the French military, and in return, New France will get the resources that are found in the colony. So mainly fish and fur, but we saw in previous lessons that there will be some metals and some lumber and things like that. This back and forth, the colony and New France, well, this is imperialism, which we've already learned about, and France becomes a richer and more powerful empire because of this. But this is a really tough start in New France. The merchants that have the monopoly from the king, they really don't care about settling any colonies there. They just want the fur because they have a monopoly to sell it in France. That's all they care about. And because of that, there are very few colonists. And you can see the population here on the right-hand side. The population doesn't grow that quick. So in 1608, we only have 28 people. And by 1698, there's just over 15,000. So that is, in 90 years, that is not a big increase in population. And again, that's because the merchants, they weren't really pushing people to come and move to New France. But King Louis XIV in 1663, he takes over from the merchant monopoly, and he gets to work on building a successful colony in New France. And he creates something called the Sovereign Council. And the Sovereign Council is made up of three very important individuals: the governor, the intendant, and the bishop. And we'll go through each of these right now. The governor, besides the king, is the most powerful person in the colony, and the governor represents the king. That's the king's personal representative. The governor is also the army official, or the main army official, and he is part of the nobility class. And we talk a lot about nobility classes next year in grade 8 social studies. And being that the governor is an army official, he is also in charge of the defense of the colony. So this role is going to be extremely important. The second important person that is part of the Sovereign Council is the intendant. This is the second most powerful person. And this individual is in charge of the day-to-day affairs. So the intendant is like a court official so he's like supervising the courts. He is helping to manage the economy. They take care of the roads, and they just make sure like the daily life of the colonists in New France is taken care of. The very first intendant was somebody by the name of Jean Talon, and he was the very first intendant, and he was there, and he started shipbuilding, the fishing industries. He saw to it that factories were built and that there were roads. He wanted jobs in the colonies so that people from France could leave France and they could settle in the colonies, and they would have a good life. They would have a place to work, they would build a good family life, and life would be a lot better. The third important person in the Sovereign Council is that of the bishop. And the bishop is the head of the church in the colony. And back in the 1600s, religion is going to be one of the most, if not the most important thing for the day-to-day life of the colonists. The bishop, although he is the head of the church, he also plays a very important role in politics as well. So he's in constant contact with the governor and the intendant so that they can make political decisions together. Francois de Laval is the first bishop of New France, and he goes and he opens a seminary in Quebec to train priests, and this seminary later becomes Laval University, which still exists today. And the Sovereign Council is reporting to the king. And the Sovereign Council has lesser officials below them, like the governor of Montreal or Trois-Rivières. There's captains, there's seigneurs, which we will talk about in a few minutes, and priests, and then they are all taking care of the citizens of New France. And the lesser officials, with the Sovereign Council, they decide that the taxes in the colony are going to be lower than the taxes that are in France. Now, this is a big deal because life is always about death and taxes. If you can pay less taxes, that is going to be of interest to people, and this will entice some people to come to New France. Now, the rules of New France, this was a new place, so obviously the rules are going to be strict and they need to be followed. But compared to France, you've got more freedom in New France because the old way of doing things is not really going to be a part of the New France culture or customs that people in France would be following. And then these colonists that are in New France, these are going to be our very first Francophone society. And Francophones they are a distinct society in Canada. And these first colonists, these are responsible and contributing members to the Francophone society. And like I said, they still exist today. I want to go back to the bishop for a minute. And I want to talk about the Catholic Church in New France. I mentioned before that religion, Catholicism, is going to be super important. And the religious orders were responsible for building the colony. They held services for the people. Nuns taught schools, so did priests. They ran hospitals. They cared for the poor. So any kind of service that was needed, you would look to the church for that service to be completed and for any help that you might need. And what the colonists did in return is they gave teeth to the church, which was a portion of their income. So whatever they made, they would give a portion of that to the church. 5%, 10%, 15%, each colonist would decide, and they would give that to the church to help the church perform services, to help build schools and teach schools, and to help for the hospitals and all that kind of stuff. We still do that today. When the church goes around and does a collection at Mass, we give. It's a portion of our income, and it goes towards all the needs of the church and to help all of the people that the church helps. Even though they were in charge of building the colony and running these services and education, all those things, their most important goal was to spread the Catholic faith. And missionaries were the ones that were in charge there. And missionaries would go around New France and into the interior of Canada with the Cour de Bois, and they would start spreading the word of God, and they would convert many First Nations. In fact, Ville-Marie, which is today Montreal, was founded to help spread the faith. So they went into the interior. They pioneered canoe routes into the interior. They helped with the Cour de Bois, who were mapping the interior, and they went out. And these missionaries kept written accounts. So one group was the Jesuits, and these were one of the most important missionaries who started arriving in New France in 1625. And they would be writing everything down, chronicling them, and kind of like a diary, and then they would send it home for their families and their friends to read. And the families and friends that were in France, they went and they published all of these writings, and it was called the Jesuit Relations. And this is an excerpt from one of the published writing of one of the Jesuits, and it goes like this: In our possessions we had the little children march before the cross and perform some service, such as carrying the lights or other things. Sounds like altar servers. Both they and their fathers take pleasure in this. Thank God this much has already been accomplished, that they do not wish to die without baptism, believing that they will be forever miserable if they pass away without it, or at least a strong desire for it, and without sorrow for their sins. So this is a Jesuit account of what's been going on with the First Nations, and how the First Nations are wanting to receive baptism. And the Jesuits, the missionaries, they went all over the interior of Canada. They went out west here. They settled many communities, many Catholic communities, and then fast forward into more modern day, they are responsible as well for much of the Catholic education that is in the western provinces. But we still have a problem. Okay, we've got the missionaries coming over. We've got some colonists coming now. But there weren't a lot of women. Okay, there were nuns, but there weren't women that were there that could raise families in New France. Now, yes, there were many, but not enough to sustain and build and create a successful colony. Women were staying away because life was very harsh in the New World. I mean, nothing was established. Everything was being built from brand new, and things will take a lot of time to build, and it's far from home. And we know it's difficult to be away from home for any extended period of time, and it will have been no different back then. The colony of New France needed women to marry men and raise families. This is the only way we are going to be successful. So the king had a solution: the filles de roi, the daughters of the king. And between the year 1665 and 1673, 900 young women made their way from France into New France to become wives to colonists who were in New France, working and living and settling and doing their thing. Many of these daughters of the king, the filles de roi, were poor, they were orphans, and life in New France was enticing because it gave them a fresh opportunity. If they ended up getting married in New France, then the king would give the couple an ox, a cow, 2 pigs, 2 chickens, some salted beef, and a purse of money. If you were in France, you wouldn't be getting anything for free. And this is what people are going to be working very hard to be able to get. And hearing that if I go to New France, if I get married, all of this will be given to me, that is going to be something that people really want. And the population here in these few years grew from 3,200 to 10,000. So this Filles de Roi, the Daughters of the King program that the king had, was very successful. And these families become the original Canadiens that are still in existence today. Staying with women in New France, religion was important, but so was family. Family was central to daily life. The women worked with their husbands, they cared for homes and raised their children. So it was a really busy time for them. Girls in New France had a better education than in France. The nuns and the priests were doing a fantastic job here in the New World, and it was open to everybody. Everybody had the opportunity, whether you were wealthy or you weren't wealthy. If you were wealthy, well, you got to go to boarding school. So you would leave and you'd go into one of the towns and you would attend boarding school. If you weren't wealthy, you still went to school. You still got a good education, but you went to a country school where you would still be able to help out with your family's farm. The nuns are the ones who ran the school. Some of the priests did too, but it was mainly the nuns. And they taught reading and writing, super important, okay, how to be literate. And they taught how to do domestic chores so that the girls that were in the colony of New France, they could grow up and they could have successful home lives for what the time period needed back then. And the majority of the schools were for girls because the boys, although they did get an education, their main thing was to farm and to run the economy and to do those types of activities back in the mid 1600s. And school was different from France. So in France, you go from a very early age, you are sent to school in the cities where you are going to learn a trade. But in New France, the children stayed home to build successful farms and to build a really strong colony. Okay, so that's going to be with farming, the shipbuilding. We saw Jean Talon that he was starting to do the fishing industry and all that kind of stuff. Which brings me now to the economy of New France. Originally, yes, the economy was all about the fur trade. But it was more than just the fur trade because most colonists were actually farmers. And there was a social structure that was based on something called the seigneurial system. And this is all new in New France, and this encompassed all of New France. We talk about social structures a lot in grade 8, but just a quick preview. Life in France was very different than life in the New World. Life in the New World, in New France, in the colonies, was more fair and there was a lot more freedom. And it was based on this structure called the seigneurial system. And basically, I got a picture here and you can kind of see as I'm going through the notes. The king is going to give land along the St. Lawrence River to seigneurs, to the nobility class. So the people in New France that have a lot of money, who made a lot of money back in France maybe, and for people who have connections maybe to the king or in some political fashion. The seigneurs then would find colonists, the habitants, to come and rent the land that's there and set up farms. That rented land is going to be along the river, and you can see here. And the river is going to be used for irrigation, and it's going to be used for travel as well. And you can see here we have the first row, and we've got the second row, and all of this is belonging to the seigneur, to the noble person. And we've got common land, so everybody can access the river. And then we have land that's going to belong to the church, and then we have a house or some sort of building on each individual habitant's land. And laws were in place to make sure that this actually worked, and the colonists, the habitants, they had to give a portion of their crops and they had to pay fees, and that had to all go to the seigneur, who would then, it's all taxes, right? So it's all going to be going back into the colony and to pay for things. And then the seigneur had an agreement with the habitants that the seigneur would build a mill and that the seigneur would also build a church. So again, that idea of religion is going to be super important. Now, all of this leads to like the early days of Canada, and we're forging the foundations of Canada. I've said this many times before, but life was way different in New France than it was in France. There was more food available to the colonists than they would have had in France, and the homes were better built because they were newer homes, and there was improvements made in home building and technology and everything that goes along with that. So life was actually pretty good. It was different, it was harder, but most people were pretty happy. They worked in the fur trades. They worked in where they were farmers. They were explorers. You can see on the map here, they went really far west. So this is a picture of a map before the 1700s. So they went pretty far west past Lake Superior and the Great Lakes. They went north to the Hudson's Bay and they explored around the Hudson's Bay. The French made it all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, where they claimed the land, Louisiana, for the king. But you also see some other colors here. We've got British colonies here, and we have also New Spain. So if the French weren't the only ones here. So they were sharing this territory not only with the First Nations, but also with the other European imperialist countries as well. We've mentioned a lot about the First Nations and the interactions that existed with the First Nations. They were positive, they were negative, they were hit, they were miss, a little bit of everything. From a colonist point of view, the First Nations were a godsend. They were very grateful for the interactions that the colonists had with the First Nations because they learned First Nation skills and technologies like surviving the winter. So they learned how to make coats and mittens from fur, boots with moose hides and things like that. So the colonists, the habitants, can really survive this brutal winter that existed in New France. But the problems were also there. And this all goes back to when Cartier first visited in the mid-1500s. And this bad blood wasn't forgotten. The French became allies with the Wendat. We saw this in previous lessons. And the British, who we will learn about in the next chapter, they are going to become allies with the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee hate the French because of what the French did to Donnacona and 9 of the other Haudenosaunee men. So they teamed up with the British. So the Haudenosaunee and the British team up, and the French and the Wendat team up. And they do this because the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat are enemies, and the British and the French are enemies. So if there's a conflict that's happening in Europe, which there always is, and it's happening between the French and the British, well, guess what's going to happen in the colonies? There's going to be conflict between the French and the British in the colonies, which means there will be conflict between the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee as well. And this made the French very uneasy, so uneasy, in fact, that the French had to, when they were farming, they would have to be armed, and they would have to carry weapons with them, and they'd have to always be on the lookout for an attack from the Haudenosaunee and vice versa. So this conflict also kept the population of New France down, and it keeps the colonists away from colonizing and settling New France. So Jean Talon, remember him? Okay, we heard about him earlier. So Jean Talon is the first intendant of New France. He's part of the Sovereign Council. He gets France to send over 1,500 trained soldiers. They attack the Haudenosaunee, and they force the Haudenosaunee into a peace treaty. This treaty will last a while, and hopefully the French are thinking that this will convince people that it's now safe to head over to New France and to help settle and colonize it. That's all we have for this part of the chapter. We are done for chapter 2, so I want you to head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.